In the spring of 1607, 13 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, 104 British men arrived on the east coast of America to start a settlement and find prosperity.
Land! Land to starboard!
The Jamestown colony would become the birthplace of the United States, but not without the grimmest struggle to survive. Within a few months, nearly 70 of the original settlers had suffered agonizing deaths. And over the next 3 years, hundreds of those who came to replace them shared the same horrible fate. Historians and scientists have proposed a number of explanations for the horrors that befell the early colonists, but they have never fully agreed on exactly what or who was to blame for the deaths. The most common theory is that the settlers died of starvation, but graphic descriptions of other terrible physical afflictions have also been found in the chronicles left behind by the survivors, leading some to believe that disease, not starvation, was responsible. And there is more. Archaeological evidence from the recently rediscovered Jamestown site raises interesting new questions about internal strife. One skeleton exhibits a dark memento of the deadly infighting that plagued the colonists. And a radical new theory suggests that the true cause of the colonists' demise is even more far-reaching and sinister than anyone suspected.
One can see significant political disruption in the leadership, and one can also see significant physical disruption in what may well have been sabotage through a poisoning event.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
History tells of the pious, hard-working pilgrims who arrived in New England to found a nation free from British religious persecution. School texts teach that they landed at Plymouth Rock in 1620, and from there, a great nation was born. But the true beginning is not as comfortable or as noble. The real foundation of the United States was laid much earlier and far to the south. In what would later become Virginia, men arrived to claim the land for the British and seek their fortunes in myths of gold. William Roods, laborer. Richard Dixon, gentleman. Captain John Smith, gentleman. The Jamestown colonists were a mixed bag of noblemen, laborers, and craftsmen. William White, laborer. James Reed, blacksmith. George Percy, gentleman. They set sail from England just before Christmas 1606, on a journey that was supposed to take a few weeks. But the winds were unfavorable, and the voyage dragged on for months. Captain John Smith documented the crossing.
We were at sea 5 months, where we both spent our victual and lost the time and season to plant.
The long, cramped journey fostered disputes among the men, who had not yet been told their positions in the colony.
On the way over, they carried sealed orders which weren't to be opened until they got here. And so the CEO hadn't been advertised. And all these gentlemen were jockeying for that position. And so there must have been a tremendous sense of tension throughout the entire voyage. So much that John Smith, of course, who always spoke when he wasn't expected to, wound up in irons.
Smith was later released, because when the ship arrived at the coast and the sealed directives were opened, he was named to the ruling council. With their orders finally clear, the crew spent 2 weeks looking for a place to settle. There were bitter disputes, but they finally decided upon an island some 50 miles up the James River from the ocean. After such a rough and tumultuous voyage, the men disembarked with high expectations. Caught up in the spirit of the expedition, which had been organized by the London, Virginia Company, they were eager to begin on the path to riches. They had finally arrived in what one poet had promised was a delicious land of pearl and gold.
The main purpose for these men to be here, no matter what was said officially about Christianizing the Indians, the savages as they call them, was to make money for the group of investors, the Virginia Company of London.
Right from the start, they were thinking of gold and silver as being the principal return. What they found was there wasn't any gold, nor was there any silver, but there was wood, a lot of wood, and there was pitch and tar. And this is, I think, is one of the things that probably upset the other sort, because they really expected they were going to have little nuggets to put in their pouches, you know, and all they got was hard work.
In the heat of their first Virginian summer, the men set out to fortify their settlement against attacks from Spain. Spain was England's age-old foe, and she had been colonizing the New World from the south. But the immediate enemy was nearer at hand. Within days of their arrival, the colonists were attacked by Native Americans, whom they thought would be peaceful. The settlers' grim ordeal had begun, and although they eventually succeeded, their colony was all but forgotten by later generations. The legacy of Jamestown was a great and democratic nation, but because of the events that molded America, it has never gained the credit it deserves. For when the Civil War ended with a Union victory, the Northern scholars wrote it out of the history books. To a victorious North, American history began with the sympathetic Pilgrims in New England, not with the true first colony of Jamestown in the South.
Yankee historians still allow very little room for Jamestown and a whole lot for Plymouth. The popular stories that I learned as a school had nothing to do with Jamestown. It was always Plymouth and the Pilgrims and their pious pilgrims with their extraordinary hats with shoe buckles on. I always thought that was very strange. But, you know, they were, in the Victorian mind, and this is when this all develops, were the right people.
I can't remember if Jamestown was even mentioned in our history classes. So but once you learn the story, it's very clear that the earliest beginnings of what became the country happened over a decade before anything was going on in Plymouth. And actually, the things that were going on here, the industry and representative government and all these jury systems and these things that are clearly part of the American society today, began at Jamestown first.
And there was a second explanation for its lack of historical status. The original fort site had washed into the river, carrying with it all remnants of the colony's early days. At least that's what Bill Kelso was told when he came to the island as a student in the 1960s.
I felt that I would be able to see the place where everything started. And I asked a park ranger where was the fort, and he pointed to the river and said it's somewhere out there. And I was crushed, you know, I've come all this way.
But Kelso had a hunch that the ranger was wrong. He thought previous excavations had simply picked the wrong spot. 30 years and a career in archaeology later, he finally got permission to put his theory to the test.
It was a staff of one. I mean, it was me at the time. And when the shovel went in the ground, I just, fingers crossed, and fortunately found right away artifacts that were the right period. And I was elated. I mean, I just remember sat down and walked over in the seat on the edge of the river and just sat down and just sort of just smiled, you know, big time. You know, wow, you know, this is going to be a real adventure.
It was going to be a look back at a very difficult time. Almost immediately after their ship set sail for the return trip to England, the original colonists were hit by a devastating illness. John Smith was one of the few who survived.
Being thus left to our fortunes, it fortuned that within 10 days, scarce 10 amongst us could either go or well stand. Such extreme weakness and sickness oppressed us.
These strange and sudden afflictions would periodically reoccur. Over the next 3 years, new colonists perished almost as fast as they arrived. Between 1607 and 1610, more than 440 of the first 500 Jamestown settlers lost their lives. Exactly what was to blame for this extreme mortality rate is one of the great mysteries of early America. No single theory has been able to account for all the deaths. For many years, the tragedy was attributed to a bad choice of settlers, lazy English gentlemen and low-class riffraff, all hopelessly ill-equipped to establish a colony.
The myth would be that the settlers were a bunch, on one side, of effete, chinless gentlemen, overdressed, and on the other side, these other sort, who very quickly found themselves in rags. That's the impression.
But archaeological evidence from the fort shows that lack of effort cannot be blamed for all the deaths. Clearly, a great deal did get accomplished.
I think one thing it does prove that they had some people that did some work is that they quickly built a fort in, it seems like, around 20 days. And that would have involved cutting down over 1,000 trees, I suppose.
All in an unexplored area under extreme and dangerous conditions. And the settlers were skilled tacticians and craftsmen. Traces of the wooden walls in the soil revealed that the fort was expertly constructed.
The configuration of the palisade lines taken together indicate that the people that came were, in fact, experienced military people, and they knew how to shape the fort that would be the most defensive against the enemy that they found out was the real one, and that was the local Powhatan Indians.
The thousands of military artifacts uncovered at the site indicate the colonists were well equipped to defend themselves.
We have found all sorts of weaponry, from edge weaponry to firearms to plate armor. Of course, they discarded a lot of it quite early on because they found that they didn't really need to have heavy plate armor in the middle of a Virginia summer. I mean, to be effective, you had to wear it all the time. You couldn't just carry it around and throw it on when an Indian attacked. And here they were, when they were attacked, it was usually under guerrilla warfare, skirmishes in the woods.
Attacks from the Indians were a constant threat, but even at their worst, the clashes could not have accounted for the appalling number of deaths. So there must have been another culprit. Evidence from the site and written records from the colony indicate that perhaps starvation was to blame. George Percy, one of the settlers, chronicled the struggle to survive during the winter of 1609. A winter that came to be known as the starving time.
Some were enforced to search the woods and to feed upon serpents and snakes, where many of our men were slain by the savages. And now famine beginning to look ghastly and pale in every face, nothing was spared to maintain life.
In a trash pit at the site, Kelso found remains that corroborated Percy's words, evidence of the gruesome morsels the colonists had been forced to eat.
I'm inside a building or a cellar that probably stood here in 1610. This is a place that maybe earlier than that, Captain John Smith could have even walked in here. When it was abandoned, it was filled in with over 30,000 artifacts that were thrown away as just trash. We found a lot of bones of animals could have been eaten. So it's probably material that was here from a traumatic time like the starving time years of 1609, 1610.
Famine compelled us wholly to devour those hogs, dogs, and horses that were then in the colony, together with rats, mice, snakes, or whatever vermin or carrion soever we could light on.
They tell us that they had to cut their horses up into dainty squares and eat them. They'd never eat their horses at home. We have elements of horse legs, and you can actually see the chop marks along the edges where the horse has definitely been butchered. And they do tell us that they had to eat the rats as well. This is the first appearance of black rats in the New World. We're seeing graphically what they're telling us in the records, that they had to resort to eating the things that they normally wouldn't.
But why was food in such short supply? Archaeologist Dennis Blanton has done research in the Jamestown area. He finds it difficult to believe that the colonists could have starved, if conditions then were the same as today.
It is hard to imagine, even today, that anyone could starve here. We are surrounded by a very rich natural area. The streams are full of fish, crabs, oysters. Forests are full of food of various kinds.
But the settlers, bent on profit, had never intended to forage, hunt, or grow their own crops. They had naively hoped to trade for food. Their plans went awry when they discovered that the Indians had no food to spare. Blanton had an idea where he might find out why. He turned to the area's cypress trees that for hundreds of years had been quietly preserving details from the past.
We're fortunate to have some of the oldest trees in the country here. There's some that are over 1,000 years old, and there are enough of them that would allow us potentially to reconstruct the climate. There's one type that consistently lives at that age here, and that's bald cypress trees. They grow in very wet environments, but we also know that they're very sensitive to wet and dry conditions.
Looking for evidence of a drought that might have caused the shortage of food, Blanton extracted thin wood core samples from the trees with a hollow drill. The delicate samples were sent for analysis to the University of Arkansas. A prolonged dry period would be indicated by yearly tree rings that formed close together.
No one had ever implicated drought in the studies before, so it was received with a bit of skepticism, both here and in Arkansas. And lo and behold, they discovered from these tree rings that the worst drought in the last 770 years occurred between the years 1606 and 1612.
Just the time the settlers were suffering. And although the colonists did eventually manage to set up trade with the Indians, in those years, the growing conditions were so dismal, the Indians were barely managing to feed themselves. They had little to offer the starving colonists. Hunger was clearly a factor, but there are some anomalies that cast doubt on the theory that starvation was the sole cause for the high mortality rate at Jamestown.
While this starvation was going on at Jamestown, down at Point Comfort, at Fort Algernon, Captain James Davis was living quite well, and the record states that they had sufficient food that they were able to feed the excess to their hogs. So we have hogs about 40 miles or thereabouts downriver. We have excess food to feed the hogs, and yet they're starving at Jamestown. This doesn't seem to fit well.
Point Comfort was within easy reach of the Jamestown colony, but the truce with the Indians was never a stable one, and it is possible that at times leaving the fort was too dangerous. Or perhaps the settlers were suffering from some other affliction that made them too weak to travel downriver. One thesis, published in the 1970s by geographer Carville Earle, proposed that disease, not starvation, was the main cause of death. Earle thought that the fatal contagion was carried in the brackish water the colonists were consuming. With no fresh springs on the island, they were forced to drink from the marshy river itself, even though they knew it was probably not safe. But they had chosen the island for defense, not health.
People have always said, what a stupid place to put a settlement. And if you're talking in terms of health, the higher ground would have been a great deal better. But from a strategic point of view, it wasn't too bad. The ships could moor close inshore. That means that help could come ashore very easily, and if you had to, you could get out very easily. And you really can't fault them for worrying about health. When they first arrive, you don't worry about health until you find you aren't healthy.
Settler George Percy confirmed Earl's suspicions. His writings reveal that the colonists had been forced to drink river water that was often foul and sometimes deadly.
Our drink was cold water taken out of the river, which was full of slime and filth, which was the destruction of many of our men.
Earl's theory is that the slime and filth were caused by the settlers' own sewage, particularly during the dry summer months. The waste would have stagnated near the fort, untouched by the river currents.
He speculated that waste that was introduced in the river from the area of the fort really didn't travel very far. It circulated with the tide back and forth, and therefore they were taking their drink from the river, and that would have introduced disease and exacerbated many of the problems that they faced.
George Percy's accounts describe the diseases that overcame them.
The 6th day of August, there died John Ashby of the bloody flux. Our people are indeed strangely afflicted with fluxes, agues.
We hear in the records that a lot of the men died of what is known as the bloody flux. And looking at medical books from that time period, dysentery is called the bloody flux.
Our men were destroyed with cruel diseases, fluxes, burning fevers.
The description of the burning fevers matched those of typhoid. And the polluted water theory has many supporters. But could the waste have been so deadly as to almost wipe out the entire colony? Evidence from other parts of the world casts considerable doubts.
I often wonder about this because the Thames in London at this time was polluted. The Walbrook stream, which came down through Moorfields, was clogged with rubbish, and yet people were drinking out of it. So I'm not sure that this was any worse, in fact possibly a little better, than some of the water that people were drinking in London at that time.
And the water was most likely only a problem in the summers, when the river currents failed to carry the waste away. But even if the contaminated water had only caused minor outbreaks, the disease in summer and starvation in winter would certainly have wreaked havoc on the struggling colony. The hardships led to conflicts among the men. As far back as the voyage from Europe, there had been fighting. But now, as things got worse and people began to expire, tensions in the fort grew out of control.
I think that there was a major civil unrest situation going on, especially after people start dying like flies in August. Mostly it's a mutiny, and there was a lot of different factions going on that either wanted to leave or wanted to change leadership. And so the first president, Edward Wingfield, was removed and replaced.
That was just the first in a series of leadership crises. And today, new archaeological evidence is beginning to paint a picture of just how bad it had become. One discovery was unearthed as the team was excavating within the boundaries of the fort. As they brushed away 400 years of soil, they came across their first human skeleton. Could the body shed light on the horrible afflictions that had killed so many settlers? Instead, the scientists were startled by evidence of a violent death, a musket ball lodged in its leg.
This is what remains of JR-102C, and we gave him a nickname of JR because we found out that this person likely died from a massive gunshot wound to his right leg.
Here was an unexpected twist in the story of the settlement. The team hoped ballistics tests with replica muskets could provide details about the event.
Fire!
We tested all the various types of weapons that could have been used at the time.
Fire!
on targets to see how far back we would get to get a spread of shot that would reflect the same spread of shot in the wound. And you had to be at least 8 feet away. JR did not shoot himself. We know that.
So who did shoot JR? Kelso began to ponder the possibilities. Had the man been killed by Indians? By Spanish soldiers? Or was he the victim of the internal strife that was rampant in the colony? To find out, Kelso sent the bones to Doug Owsley, one of the top forensic anthropologists at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. He hoped they would reveal what had happened to JR.
There's nothing in the archaeological record that you can recover that can tell you more about a people, a past people, than the opportunity to learn from the bones themselves. The skeleton can tell you volumes, and in his case, he's a very special fellow. He's full of mystery. We've been trying to figure him out for more than 2 years, and we still have lots of things that we don't understand.
Owsley's first task was to establish sex and age.
There's no question in my mind that this is a male. The features that we see in the pelvis, certainly the size and length of the long bones, the definition of the muscle attachment areas at different locations, those are all male characteristics. In the same sense, when you're talking about a male skull, males tend to have more slope to the forehead on average, whereas females tend to have a much more vertical forehead. Those features all identify this individual as a male. With regard to age, one of the things that we see in this individual is that this tibia, this shin bone, the proximal tibia, still has a well-defined growth plate line right here, indicating that this individual is still growing. And again, comparing it to known reference samples, you can use that to assign an age to an individual.
Owsley was confident the skeleton was that of a healthy young man who was about 20 years old when he died. The body had been buried in a coffin within the fort, indicating that he would have been from the higher class. A shroud and shallow grave in the woods would have sufficed for those of lower status.
The way this was excavated is that you go down through until you hit the skull. You assume that's going to be the highest in elevation. And that'll give you an idea of where the rest of the body is, so you can slowly go down to these other pieces. So we literally excavated him from head to foot. I remember that very vividly, because as we went down the leg, and then suddenly here was this musket ball in the bone, I just, at that moment, I understood something about how traumatic or how challenging it was to be at Jamestown, because we would expect to find, if a person was shot, arrow points. And they said, wait, this is a European weapon, killed this guy, and it's unlikely the Indians had those. If this dates to that 1607 period, they're shooting each other, either accidentally or on purpose. There's real civil unrest going on, and sure, you think about, well, people starving, the rules change.
There was lead shot all through this area of the bone, but the largest piece, this round ball, was located right here. And this is it. And one of the things about this round ball, they had made a slice into it. Now, the function of that, perhaps, is to cause the bullet to break up upon impact.
But the mystery of JR's death went beyond the actual gunshot. Further investigation of the body raised questions about where it was from.
By all indications from the archaeological record, he should be a very early burial. That means he should be English. But one of the things that we've done is we've looked at his bone chemistry, and when you do that, it doesn't fit with an Englishman. And that's the mystery.
JR's bone chemistry indicated that he had lived on a typically American diet. But bone chemistry changes as a person grows. Tooth enamel, however, only traps minerals from when a person is young. To determine for sure where JR was from, Bill Kelso sent a tooth to Bradford University in England, where an analysis would reveal details of JR's childhood. If the results showed that he was raised in England, Kelso could feel comfortable that he was indeed one of the early settlers.
The reason for looking at a tooth really is because the tooth enamel is a very good archive. It preserves material that the person consumed or elements from the person's diet during life. And some of those elements can tell us something about where the person actually came from, where the person actually grew up. Your enamel is formed in early childhood. Unlike various other tissues in the body, like bone is remodelled and changes over your lifetime. Your enamel, once it's formed, that's it, it's fixed, it's not going to change again.
A sample of JR's tooth enamel was vaporized with a laser beam in order to release the oxygen isotopes that were contained in the water he drank as a child. This data was then cross-referenced with the results of a mass spectrometry test for the element strontium. Strontium levels reflect specific geological regions, so the two tests together would provide a detailed picture of where the man was from. The evidence was unambiguous.
It's really pinpointing Cornwall as by far the most likely place where JR could have come from.
So despite the initial bone chemistry questions, JR was most likely born in England, indicating that he probably was an early arrival. But the actual events of his death remain a mystery.
Well, I think that the scientific techniques that are being discovered now are going to be an amazing aid to finding out more about the past. But it's also true that they are often at odds, the various tests. So we keep coming up with, it seems to me, more questions than answers, but eventually I think it's going to reveal a full story.
For now, all that is sure is that JR was killed at close range by a settler's gun. And as other finds are made at the fort, the question again shifts to the high mortality rate in the early years of the colony. While the archaeological evidence that has been found so far reinforces traditional theories about the causes of death, many questions remain unanswered. Some of the symptoms described by the settlers simply cannot be accounted for with the usual explanations.
Master Scrivener lay exceeding sick of a mad fever, and in regard of the weakness of the company and the heat of the year. Some have licked up the blood which hath fallen from their fellows.
There were deadly swellings, skin peeling off of bodies, extreme weakness, sudden deaths, strange episodes of madness, not the typical symptoms of typhoid, dysentery, and starvation.
Hugh Price, being pinched with extreme famine, in a furious, distracted mood, did come openly into the marketplace, blaspheming, exclaiming, and crying out that there was no God.
The descriptions were horrific, and for one independent scientist, they invoked global images of politics as well as local suffering. Dr. Frank Hancock traces his ancestry back to very early Virginia, and his heritage has left him fascinated by the history of the Jamestown colony. The early 1600s was a critical point in international affairs. At the time, Catholic Spain controlled most of the New World, from South America all the way north to Florida, and it laid claim to the rest of North America. But so did Protestant England. Jamestown, caught in between, took on great significance as a foothold for North America.
England could become a dominant power if it could establish Jamestown. Those who got here first established a fort and found the shortest route to the South Seas and discovered any gold here would certainly reign supreme, not only in England, but possibly globally.
As a pathologist, Frank Hancock has never been completely convinced by the traditional explanations of the settlers' deaths. His suspicions were first raised by the sudden onset of the strange symptoms.
Everything seemed fine up until the time the original ships left to go back to England. And John Smith states that within approximately 10 days, hardly anyone could stand or walk. And this seems like a rather sudden change in health status that was rather striking.
Hancock noticed that the incidents all seemed to occur when help was just out of reach, and in a pattern of distinct episodes. Not a typical scenario for disease or starvation. To him, they looked more like a deliberate epidemic. Combing the historical records and applying his knowledge of pathology and medicine, Hancock came up with a startling hypothesis. He believed there was evidence of poisoning at Jamestown.
I think this settled uneasily on my mind, and then I began to reflect on epidemiological studies and how those studies often track sudden deaths and episodic illnesses to a single cause. As I searched back through my memory of some years of medical practice, I began to think of a poisoning episode, and I began to think of what would be the common poisons. And arsenic poisoning became a concept that seemed rational to me.
To see if his theory was possible, he began to compile a detailed list of all the symptoms mentioned by the settlers.
Now, these people are no longer alive, obviously, so they cannot be interviewed. And all that I had was George Percy's writing and John Smith's writing. So I went back and read these, and I just jotted down any adjective, any sign, any symptom, any phrase that might be construed as a clinical sign or symptom.
Next, Hancock researched the toxicity of arsenic and the symptoms of the other diseases mentioned at Jamestown. Sure enough, he found that while typhoid and dysentery could account for some of the illnesses, arsenic could explain them all. The lists matched up remarkably. Arsenic could have been responsible for the explosive diarrhea and the burning fevers, for the delusions and apparent psychoses, for the swellings, extreme weakness, and famished appearances, and for the bruising and sudden deaths. Then, by sheer coincidence, Hancock made another significant connection. A murder case in his own hometown brought to light an additional bizarre symptom of arsenic poisoning. A local man, poisoned by his girlfriend, had suffered chronic skin peeling before he died. Hancock remembered from the records that similar cases had been recorded at Jamestown.
The skin exfoliation episode occurred when a group of settlers were sent to what was known as the oyster banks to live because the food supply there was plentiful. And they described an episode of their skins peeling off, and that was an unusual observation. So I searched one of my general textbooks, and exfoliative dermatitis was mentioned as one of the possible consequences of arsenic poisoning.
Just one more tie between the settlement and the poison. But why would arsenic have been present in Jamestown? In the early 17th century, poisoning was common in Europe. Essentially colorless and odorless, arsenic was the venom of choice in aristocratic circles, and it was widely available.
At that time, in the 1600s, it's my understanding that there were two commercial uses of arsenic. One of the uses of it was that women would use arsenic and carry it in a small item on their body so that they could use a small taste of it in order to induce paleness, because paleness was desired at that time.
But there were no women in Jamestown, and so no need for these cosmetic vials. Its second use, however, as a pesticide known as ratsbane, would have justified its presence.
Ratsbane would have been an agent that would have been aboard a ship, and ratsbane, according to modern dictionaries, is arsenic trioxide.
John Smith's records indicate that ratsbane was present in the colony. But was there a plot to use it on the settlers? Frank Hancock believes that both internal conflict and international political posturing could have given rise to such a scheme. But others are not as easily convinced.
The theory that there was a conspiracy of someone purposely poisoning people at Jamestown, to me, while it is possible, is not probable. I don't see enough evidence that says that that's the case. There was plenty of ways to die here besides that. I mean, there was just everything else.
You think that's a pretty dumb suggestion, but then, of course, the CIA and MI5 have done some pretty crazy things, too. But in actual fact, it could have happened. It really could. Because when the English went up to have a peace conference with the King of the Chesapeake, the physician brewed up poisoned ale. And as a result, they poisoned 200 Indians, including the chief and all his family and all his lords and so on. So it could have happened.
This horrific poisoning of the Indians happened in 1623, long after the initial hardships. But it does indicate that the colonists were not above using poison, and that they had the knowledge to do so. In addition, Hancock was finding evidence that at the time the first settlers arrived in Jamestown, there were numerous other poison plots being hatched back in Europe. He also found some interesting personal connections between these old world schemes and the colony.
I set aside the medical issues and began to go back to reading general history. And then that takes you back to England, where you have to consider internal English politics and see how the divisions within England were interacting with Spain.
The principal political conflict in England at the time was between Protestants and Catholics. It had only been 70 years since King Henry VIII had broken away from the Vatican and founded the Anglican Church. In the years that followed, both sides made a habit of persecuting the other. England was officially Protestant, but the Catholic faction was still strong and was often assumed to be in league with Catholic Spain, whose military might was financed by gold from the New World. Accusations of treason were commonplace.
Everybody thought there was a Spaniard under the bed. And there were a lot of admitted Catholics, but many more closet Catholics. And I think that the Protestants felt that any Catholic was a potential spy.
Hancock began to theorize that one of the Jamestown settlers could have been a Catholic and part of an English or Spanish scheme to destroy the Protestant colony. This traitor could have discreetly poisoned the town's food supply. Despite the fact that Jamestown has always been thought of as a Protestant colony, recently discovered artifacts show evidence that there were Catholics present.
We have found some artifacts reflecting Catholic iconography, and it's been quite surprising. I mean, we were kind of shocked. Bits of rosaries and some crucifixes and religious medallions showing the Immaculate Conception and that kind of thing. Not what you think of when you imagine Anglican Jamestown.
As the internal conflict in the colony escalated, suspicions would have run high. In fact, Captain George Kendall, one of the most capable officers in the settlement, was actually accused of being a Spanish spy and executed.
Present your piece. Give. Fire.
The fact that they would do that suggests that this level of paranoia must have been really very high indeed, because you don't throw away one of your best men just because you think he may be spying.
Perhaps the bullet in JR's leg was yet more evidence of this paranoia. Either way, Hancock believes he has evidence to prove that a Jamestown plot would have been masterminded from Europe. It could even have been someone involved in one of the other plots to overthrow the Protestants. Just a year earlier, in one of the most famous terrorist incidents in British history, the Catholics had tried to blow up the British Parliament. The conspiracy was known as the Gunpowder Plot, and its ringleader was a Catholic named Guy Fawkes. He was arrested on November 5, 1605, just minutes before the explosion was to take place. And to this day, the British light fireworks on the anniversary of his execution. Before he was killed, however, Fawkes mentioned a number of his associates. Among them was a shady character named Baron Thomas Arendelle. Arendelle was an ardent Catholic and a notorious plotter with an interest in chemistry.
Thomas Arendelle was a fanatic Catholic. It is the story of this family over 150 years that they were militant Catholics. In many ways they were disloyal, but their objective was to get freedom of religion so the Catholics could worship freely in England.
Arendelle fought for freedom in England, but he also had a fervent desire to establish a Catholic colony in the New World.
Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
At the time he thought there was the prospect of having an approved Catholic settlement, Arendelle put up the funds for a boat called the Archangel to go out to the coastline of Maine and northern Maryland on a reconnaissance expedition, and it was extremely successful.
But the following year, when the Virginia adventure was put together, Catholics, such as Arendelle, were effectively pushed aside. Only a year or so later, he had another opportunity to lead an expedition to the New World, but his lack of money and refusal to pledge loyalty to the Protestant Church destroyed his chances.
He was deputed to be captain of an expedition which would include 500 English Catholic soldiers and 500 Irish, and they would go to the northern area and they would colonize it. And then that fell apart again. He couldn't get a patent from the king, and he was furious. And it's then that he really determined to do his best to destroy Virginia.
Awake, traitor! Awake!
In fact, just months after the colonists arrived in Jamestown, one of Arendelle's associates was arrested on his way to Spain.
With intent, as is thought, to have betrayed his friends and showed the Spaniards a means how to defeat this Virginian attempt.
Even more damning, the only surviving sketch of Jamestown Fort, giving away its exact location on the James River, is one found with the papers of Don Pedro de Zuniga, the Spanish ambassador in London. Also in the Spanish archives was a letter from the ambassador to King Philip III of Spain, describing Arendelle's desire for revenge against the British. According to Zuniga, Arendelle had offered to leave England, fake capture by the Spanish, and then lead them to the Jamestown colony.
The truth is that they have failed to send him out because he is suspected of being a Catholic. He is actively discontented, and he has told me that he will perform an extraordinary service in regard to this matter.
Baron Thomas Arendelle is reported by Ambassador Zuniga to offer his services to Spain, and that he would come to America and show them a means how to de-establish Jamestown without recourse to arms.
For one reason or another, the plan did not come to fruition. Perhaps at that point, thinks Hancock, a more subtle scheme was devised. It would not be the first time Arendelle and his acquaintances had used poison.
One of his associates, John Stanley, who came from Spain, was arrested and confessed he was going to spread a poisonous perfume around Queen Elizabeth and would kill her. The other person arrested actually put poison all over the pommel of her horse.
And on an earlier occasion, when Arendelle was arrested for setting up a clandestine international meeting, a telling reference to poisoning was found amongst his papers.
There are references in his past to having been interested in how to poison the air so as to infect an entire camp.
Hancock believes that this is a clear reference to a Catholic plot to quietly poison the Protestant colony. Such an undertaking would have been extremely beneficial to the Spaniards. It would have given them a chance to impede the British expansion into the New World without the need for a costly military expedition. For Arendelle, it would have exacted the sweet revenge he felt he deserved. And there is ample indication that he was not above conspiracy.
What business am I in this affair, sir?
But returning to the present, can Hancock actually confirm the use of poison in the colony? Without it, his theory can never be proved. Unfortunately, the only certain test for arsenic poisoning requires soft tissue, hair, or nails. And all such remains from Jamestown have long turned to dust. However, Hancock is able to obtain a few human bone samples from the early settlement. And he asks his colleague, toxicologist Richard Early, to test them for any traces of the poison. The chances of finding remnants of arsenic in the bones are slim, especially after 400 years. But when the samples are analyzed in a plasma mass spectrometer, the computer readout reveals definite traces of heavy metals, including arsenic, designated AS.
In essence, what we came up with was a small presence of these metals, and the level was down in the lower parts per million range.
The results are tantalizing but inconclusive, since at these levels the bones could have been contaminated by the soil after they were buried. Nevertheless, for Hancock, it is forensic evidence that his theory could be correct. It gives him the incentive to continue to peruse the records for more hints of the conspiracy. And even though it has not been embraced by other experts in the field, it does make sense in the context of the times. To Hancock, international politics, religious turmoil, and personal vendettas may all have played their part in the tragedy at Jamestown, and he is still convinced that one day his theory will be accepted as the truth.
I think the circumstantial evidence seems somewhat convincing, and I think the literature available and the writings of that time need to be reread and reassessed from this point of view. I think the possibility of sabotage at Jamestown, both political and physical, is rather strong, and I suspect that the events will be proved.
For now, the weight of evidence still supports a less radical view, that the settlers succumbed to a crushing combination of local conflict, natural disasters, and devastating disease. Things eventually got so bad that after the starving time in 1610, the few remaining survivors left the colony in search of a more hospitable site. But as they were leaving, they encountered a new fleet from England and were persuaded to turn back. Out of the ruins, a new beginning was made. In 1613, settler John Rolfe, who later went on to marry the legendary Pocahontas, cultivated a sweet breed of tobacco that became the financial savior of the colony. From that point on, the troubled settlement slowly revived. Close to 400 years after Jamestown was founded, the site is beginning to reveal its secrets, and the reality of what these early settlers endured is finally coming to light.
Next time, new forensics at an old African battlefield. The British colonials suffered a staggering loss and claimed to have been brutally outnumbered.
By bloodthirsty savages. No. No.
Now, the evidence reveals sophisticated techniques and tactics that led to a Zulu victory. A new examination of the Day of the Zulu as we uncover secrets of the dead. Reopen investigations of the past at PBS Online. History is revealing its forgotten secrets at pbs.org.